Welcome to the Splice Poetry Series. This is a special one because this is technically our season finale of season 1. We started in January of this year, and so that's, we have a full season, and we kick it off season 2 next month. So it is my great pleasure to say the poets Ian U Lockaby and Adam Clay will be reading tonight, and we have Splice's own Sean Monroe introducing Ian.
Welcome, welcome. It's nice to see some familiar faces out here for this December reading. Ah, yeah. Gotta get a little tall on it. I'll bring it down for you, Ian. I'll bring it down. No problem. All right. Ian U Lockaby is a poet, translator, and editor. Formerly, he was a farm worker in and around Olympia, Washington for over 7 years and forever thinks inside vegetables. And this thinking inside the vegetable, while simultaneously living outside the vegetable, and tracking the sharing of our molecules in our eating and growing of vegetables, blooms in a chromatic cubist spirals of syntax in Ian's poems. These poems embrace the true messiness of our experiential attentions through what seems to be a biological Marxist critique of a person's immediate biome. He shows us, with these complex immersions, the sticky systems we think and survive within. His poems have been, or will be published in Finch, Denver Quarterly, Prelude, Interim Poetics, 6 Finch, Witness Magazine, Poetry Daily, and elsewhere. His translation of Chilean poet Carlos Cociña's Jardines was published by Cardboard House Press in November 2021, and his translations also appear in journals such as the Arkansas International, Black Warrior Review, Anomaly, and Washington Square Review. His translations of Cociña's poems have fertilized an overlooked field in Chilean poetry. These translations show Ian's distinct ability to transfer and apply agricultural lexicons to our contemporary symbol systems as an examination of the pressures we exert on our ecologies. This chapbook was also one of Action Books' favorite books of poetry and translation in 2021, rightly so. In more recent news, Ian's chapbook, A Seam of Electricity, won the Editor's Choice chapbook selection with the Press Go's proposal, and might be out next year. A little round of applause for that sweet chappy. Yeah, you're right. He has studied at LSU, the Evergreen State College, UNAM in Mexico City, and the Center for Book Arts in New York City. From 2018 to 2021, he was an editor at New Delta Review. He now edits Mercury Furs, an online journal of poetry and translation, whose first issue was published this summer. After reading that stellar first issue, one can see that his editorial skills demonstrate an embodied cultural sensitivity to what matters and what works in poetry. You can read that first issue now at mercuryfurs.org. That's furs as in the trees, FIRS.org. He is also contributing editor at Tilted House with Fahima Ife. And with Fahima Ife co-edits the forthcoming journal Lucius. Please welcome to the Splice stage, Ian U Lockaby.
Sean, thank you so much. That was incredible. So generous, beautiful, over generous. So much. Thank y'all so much for having me. Sean, Henry, Rodrigo. I appreciate so much what y'all are doing with Splice. Like, I've enjoyed coming to these readings so much over the past, what has it been now, a year or something? And I'm really looking forward to more of them. And thank y'all so much for coming to hear me read some poems today. That light is intense. I'm gonna read from 3 different little things. Actually, let me keep my time here. want to lose track of time and bore you. But before I get into my own things, I want to read a poem by a poet named Javier Araya, who's a poet who passed away recently, and he was a really good friend of mine. And this was actually the last thing that I talked to him about, was this reading, because I had put up the flyer on the Instagram, and he asked me, "What's that?" And I said, "It's a reading, you should come." And so I wanted to bring him along. And so he's a Mexican poet, and so this is my translation of one of his poems. Breathe. Breathe, body, breathe, lung, wing of ash, tree of blood. Eat the air out of the world and let nothing out. Open up like the mouth of an ocean. Swallow the coastal cities, the palm trees, and the tourists. We have accustomed ourselves to disaster of body, to being a wave, being a fist of water, to having an unpredictable heart, a sandstorm in place of eyes, a pair of suicidal goshawks glimpsing each other, falling into our nervous hands. To breathe, what's important is to keep breathing. The poem's elaboration follows the same route as the instant of a car crash, going from the disaster towards the last exhibition of the disaster. When what's real returns a suspicion, a scent of fuel and blood soaking glass, and women screaming as if behind a very thin wall. The parentheses between the instant and the instant, the poem and the writer of the poem. Not that of the poem we vainly pretend, but what we are when housed by the poem with more resignation than wisdom. Repetition that is blind obedience, wisdom that is clumsy repetition. But death, who travels in the passenger's seat, is who dictates the turns and the names that an auditorium of passers-by watches pass by from the little windows, spectacle that they will forget, mere words, their eyes accustomed to the stupidity, to the motionless speed of traffic, to flipping channels. So that was Raya. And now, something else. This that I'm going to read is the chapbook that's coming out from Ghost Proposal at some point in the future, nearby. It's called The Seam of Electricity. I wrote it, I started writing it when I was living in a house without electricity in New Orleans for about a month and a half, and I was kept alive and well and comfortable by my good friend and neighbor Poochie Lee, who this book is really dedicated to. But this is thinking through that. It's kind of a long poem essay, maybe something like that. A seam of electricity. What is a house unelectrified, situated on a continent-wide grid of electrical possibilities? Failure in the interiors of modernity, just a keystone limber in the going logics of domestic illumination, or is it even legible by the tools we have of reading houses, grids, of reading settlement? Does it even exist in the eye of utility? A blacked out house on a street of electricity, a blur in the fabrics of light, a dropped stitch in a seam of electricity. Asemia, a failure to express symbols and semantic logics. The house fails in its logics, with its wiring betraying an orientation toward utility grid semantics. Therefore, we are living in a kind of asemia, a failure in utility that only our good neighbor half saves us from with the kindness of an extension cord running off the back of her house and through a window crack into mine. Only neighbors make a home finally legible, no matter. In the eye of stormed failures of the grid or unfailing mechanisms of gridded out poverty or the owner class's steeled indifference, neighbors invent legibility in synaptic congress. In dilating extensions, they form apertures to let the light in. Our neighbor's electricity is extended from the grid into what? A blurry edge it was wired for. Those who fail their neighbors tend to fail with the grid. A non-powered grid-like thing atop a grid-like thing. A grid width being with citywide widths of aperture. I wake up with a go-cup full of things that I hope to keep forever. Overnight, the rising dough molded. The bread book fell off the shelf into what I saw in the dark as a great carbon fire on the kitchen floor. Where were we now? I'd slept as if I were over a hot carbon barrier to the earth, megahertz eating the dream. In the darkness of last night, owl hoots with my hands attached. I realized there was a kitten living in the corner of my room. In the dream, the kitten had birdhouses for sale. I'd slept like a dog underwater. What do you call that? In the dream, the burning questions. Is the kitten hunting birds or a real estate agent? What else would it wait for in sooty corners such as these, when a little fire off the stove's the only light? Burning tree sap for scent, sautéed animal fat settling into the walls, the space between flesh and sooty bone grows sweet, sweet and sweeter. What inside the light can be seen in the light, with the light? The underbelly of the bolted shrubs sliding into the fat of the leady yard. You, the vernacular of the house when you stand and look at it. In the fuzz, wetted music of the sub-transmission lines humidified through the near and thick of the atmosphere. Utility poles grow metal teeth inside their metal frames like hard light on water. Don't be shy in the vernacular, the thin timbered yard intoned with its many ways out. There are many ways in, but never to the center. In a light wind, the cat's claw swayed on the high dead limbs. We wake up in an unelectrified house, thinking about how the color palettes of our environments must have changed so drastically with the advent of electricity. The colors of especially urban ecologies suddenly kneaded into themselves intensities only possible by electric productions. The luminous logic of those hues and what leapt loud in the visual semantic. The semantic intensity piercing our aqueous humors and the change in our brain that followed. The change in our dreams that followed. Then again, where is the logic of color made? In the sockets, in the skull, or in the electric veins of the age? Has every conceivable color always been available to our minds? Notes towards a study of historical perception and dreams. Notes towards the color spectrum of dreams throughout the history of humankind, etc. Studies only possible to mount on the dream plane, which is more accessible anyway, perhaps, sans electricity. Notes towards a study of megahertz levels in sleep during different intervals of the night. I get distracted by the word sans, like, I don't think I say that right. Is it sans? Sans? Sans electricity. It threw me off, and then I'm reading, but I'm not actually reading. I'm just thinking about how I mispronounce sans. Whereas utility is necessary and monitored, Not by the state exactly, but by contracts of the state exactly. When the man comes out to turn on the gas lines, he is kind, asks about the electricity, so I tell him my new landlord is scum, has been lying to me about various holdups while we wait and wait to be permitted for power. The man is sympathetic, very mildly indignant on my behalf, and says, you know, it's more common than you think. With the morning, we can't tell. I walk the blocks and it seems every house might be without electricity. I can see the neighborhood beyond the expression of its electrical logics. Sunshine inside a telephone pole. It looks nearly the same any mid-morning as it does day after a storm smacks the power off. Only then it's a little somehow stiller. It's predated, too far inside of time. The edges of space coming into contact. A palpability. Space is a pulp. Until from next door, a blender's hard hum shatters the asemic trances. In the seams of me, I feel a sound like hard sprouts of utility. A conduit primps itself in the dawn, becomes conduit to the atmospheric animosity. We are wired for utility. We live in nests of utility intact. Walls, comfortable temperatures, vital hydrations, a space to accumulate our wage trades. All the interior facets of a space that might incubate decent workers. In affect, we live in little grids nested inside the larger grid. A mosquito floats in and lands on a seam of the grid. Now the currents vary room to room and shift overnight according to the breezes. A mosquito in a high corner can alter the roots, its blood-filled thorax lighting up imperceptibly. I wake up and I say to myself, don't think. This is little use, because the thoughts, the anxieties, they still come. The exhortation is just a gentle, porous roadblock. In blunt-tipped leaves in the bugged-out skies. I don't know where I went. The moon is rusting and everyone is stunned. If at some point I began to mourn the loss of my dark house and the wired tether between me and my neighbors made visible, what am I mourning but the seams, or asemia and the freedom from semantic meaning, from utility? Thick scent of a great blunt leaf wrapping into the window pores too. I'm on a slow, meandering walk in my neighborhood when I look down and realize I'm walking upon a section of map that traces the same grid that it's situated over. I bend down, peel up a fistful, and tear a fray across the surface. Underneath, it opens to a larger map of a larger grid underneath intact. A vertigo breezes through me. When I can stand, I rise and see a neighbor on their porch, and with my hand still clutching the torn map of the grid, I wave slowly. All right, they say. Language is breaking apart in our hands. In the darkness, we can only make out the shapes of letters on the page. We've been reading like this for hours, or forever it seems, but now the sun fades out our windows and particles of darkness block the white bays the letters gather in their limbs, the blank spaces that make them legible, where the illuminate of the bright page makes shape. Each word suddenly the shape of a small animal, lines of small animals creating a blurred grid on the page. A moment longer, and the darkening brings out the beady eyes, glowing, reflecting the light from the headlight of our eyes. An inherent light inside the eye. Who had that idea that I feel now in my sockets? In the neighboring dark yards, the no cherry glow, but a single candle left flickering out. The matter of electricity is unverifiable in this house. Next door, you might find another way in. One takes tweezers to the outlets and tries to pluck it out. One wraps it around a stick like a caduceus and the long snake of modernity. This health, this electricity, this health. How often we are healed with electricity, how often we are damaged with it. To slowly pull the strings of electricity from the house over a period of weeks, wrapping it around a stick in the yard. Notes towards an incision. Once the light burns out the oils, we move under the filament of fats. Anything will do. Materials for conduction are sifted from the ground. Our walls grow more porous with the rising cost of copper intake. Forced into, or onto, or gripped by the weather. I wake up to a flood of what I was trying to harness all night. But the electricity verifies us. The most southern routes to wire exposure leave my body a bit frayed, no matter. When you hold a predated morning, the morning of something to come, inside yourself just a while, it becomes a part of you that settles, that kneads in, that lights up imperceptibly in your eye. You begin mourning the loss of the predated morning, and then you mourn losing that morning too. In this way, a predated morning will always sprout and proliferate, because the object of mourning is still alive in you. And the mourning for it will animate and mate with it, and its offspring will mate with it. It's a terrible incestuous thing in your head, and if it gets into your heart, it was always there. To arrive at the candle left flickering the width of a season. The grid has already failed. Tempting to say, all grids fail from the beginning of their shape. Their logic slip when applied to the interior of an ant. An ant goes everywhere and nowhere at once, meets its kind with a know-how. Below the grid, the fingerlings fine. The seams burning and the light showing asemic documents of an old order. The bad pulped papers. They don't compost nicely, but they do. Asemia and darkness mated and proliferated through me. Electricity sprouts in my sockets anyway. Darkness whips my palm and it doesn't hurt a bit. Under the candle flame, atmospheric pressure effervesces in the wax. The lit wick makes an iris in the almond deadbolt. I made a small incision in the back of the house. Over a period of weeks, through the blister that formed in the wall, I pulled the wiry snakes of electricity out of the house they wound through. It had to be a slow and steady, a secret, minor pull, so as not to snap the lines, so as not to agitate the electricity into a drive for reclamation. Sudden sprouts of sparking larvae in the walls and calls to the electric company and electronic bills for services. Slowly, slowly, I wrapped the lines around a stick, and when it got to be too much, around a tree at the back of the yard. Weeks, though, stretched on to months, and I wondered if it was possible, or if the grids through the house ran into a bottomless subterranean store of electrical lines below, grids all the way through the earth. If I was just tugging foolishly at the outer seam of a massive skein that would never unravel, never to be touched at its core, I kept pulling. You could see now the porous walls of the house buckling at the slow tug. To live, to lie in the crumbling semantics of the mistaken roots of electricity. And that's that one. Thank you. So I have this other collection called Defensible Space If a Crow, which I think about really separately, partly because it's just like, it belongs in a different landscape, which is kind of how I think about my poems, which I think is kind of old-fashioned, so I'm sorry, but that's just how I do. This one is kind of situated for me in the Northwest where I lived before I came here. And it's a little bit about farming, but not really. Also about forest fires, because you're always choking on that in the summer out there. And about crows, because crows are interesting. Even though all the poems have been written about crows, there's still more to say about crows, I think. And I knew it was something that I shouldn't do, is write poems about crows. So I just wrote as many poems about crows as I could. I don't know if that's worth it, sure, but then. And then I got rid of a lot of them, and I was left with some that are better. So this is called. I'll just read from this for 10 more minutes, and then you're done with me. So if a crow. Defensible space, if a crow. If a crow, then a black ice cube pressed against the grain of the sun. While the afternoon mugs drop pattering spoils of a milked black cough, and the overgrown carpets lay a caffeinated belly, bitter against the sleep, against the damn bright slipping away. If a crow remembers you by what? Something growly in a vanilla leaf. Don't dawdle now, it's plenty late. A way to tell. These are a little more like poem-y, Some of them sound like reading poems. And some of them have titles even. Yeah. A way to tell. You're learning a lot of sad, useful things upon the leaves of this awful summer. This book is great, how it makes you hear different. Layers of it amplified in the stacked noise of the striated river at different times. You've grown and used at different times. You've learned to keep time with each of them, stacked and riveted to your ribcage now. And every time you stand, I try to stay still, to be located inside of the ways that I hear. While at the upper edges of the sages there becomes something less sage than a turbid herbal air. Under our hands on the tablecloth, a mountain is running towards the city. In the air above it is little attention to these maps. Cirque, medial moraines, andesite, the cold lava. Defensible space 1. Maybe I will detox like the forest. Maybe I will detox like the dead. Even breathing that smoke now, how will it ever rid me of itself? The smoke off the crow, the smoke off the crow that tells of that fire in the forest, the burning lung the charred birds were breathed from, the must of broiled fur resins trapped in the embering feather down of their young. Defensible space is a term that they use to talk about the space that you clear out the brush around, like houses when you're trying to protect from forest fire. That's my understanding of it. And I became really fascinated with that term, and the ways that, of course, like the ways we approach protecting property and when it's built in a forest that needs to have fires has always been interesting to me. I could go on, but I won't, because that would be boring. A picnic basket full of the names you've had for the herbs in your food. Bad, good, uncontrollably laughing with a mouthful. A blackberry vine growing up through the wicker bottom of everything. Songbirds mysteriously dying. Inside of this life is another life I cannot claim. The cicadas' hum distracts the intelligence of dogs. Cicadas hum and mysteriously kill songbirds. A panic takes in the internet. Birding groups arguing over whether to offer the birds water. Throw it in the trees instead, they say. Outside of one's reason is another life. If a crow a manic feather copulated with, when a weather turns black feathers, cherry juice seeping from the living ground, under the weight of every step away through autumn. Once a whale ate a crow. It was the meeting of the loud, dark sky and the quiet, many cathedrals of the sea. The whale belly is my belly, is our belly, is the quiet cathedrals full of belly silks. I taste a sulking crow in the season. I devour many mediocre specimens of us, myself. Should have taken these pages out. Forecast. Not to be what one has been, but that I can only have been what I was, and so on. A banana in your fist in a climate of catastrophe. Seance of coffee sap and stone. The air is cold here, even in summertime. And it was summertime, it was cold, it's snowing ash. The best thing to have happened to my lifestyle is my lifestyle, which practically ate the moth as it landed on this page. Are there plenty of places for you to rest in the sun, moth? You choose me. You are the second best thing to have happened to my life. You choose me. Again and again. If a crow, it's ambergris. I wanted to make one rhyme with you. Lambent grays under the toilet skies. You, so long I am here to terrify myself with my tininess. If it wasn't any trouble, it was all another drink. And if the rhyme wouldn't want with you, it'll take itself back. I'm summering in the bathroom stall, memorizing sanitation law and tide tables of the toilet seas. I'm little enough to see fair, but when I try to flush the big parent crow so that I might ride its weight downward and out towards autumn, the quiet cathedrals, the body of the bird won't fit, and the tides come back that night, whale waked, harvest wake. Could it take itself back, as the waking wants with you? Days later, the two bodies, crow and whale, stink together in a flesh-bog unison never replicated. To think of the possible pairs of flesh, feather, fiber, never yet found duetting rot. What could it do for our senses to enjoy them, or the perfume possibilities in the bile duct of a crow? In the terrible season, fledgling crows, bounty dead upon the lawns, land falling ambergris struck cold with tinnitus, down before the first flight. Now for our profit. If I tried to make this rhyme, it would say, of all the crows buried at sea, whatever happened to your plastic dolly, your marionette nose, the garbage pails in which you collected your plastics, marked with that occult triangle, making you believe in the myth that whatever went in would be churned back in to our tide of things, our tide of things, our tide of things, our tide of things, but they dump it in the sea. I'll just read you 2 more. Does that sound right? Yeah. Time-wise? You don't have a timer?
Oh, I said I don't have a timer, but go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Laura. This poem is called, I hate when people say that, I'm sorry. Amiss. I don't hate when people say that. If you say that, it's okay. I just hate when I say it. Amiss. In the middle of the street is everyone you know. You stand on the sidewalk, though missing them. They begin to spread out around the neighborhood, looking for the cat you lost as a child. You don't remember its name, but they all seem to. They're all calling out, "Rain! Rain, don't go away. You're a cat, and I miss you, and you're gone." In the middle of the street is the cat you lost as a child. You used to miss him, but you don't anymore. It begins to rain, but the cat doesn't move. It just stares at you, wide-eyed, as rain washes the morning dew from the back of his ears. You think of who you were the day you lost that cat. You can remember how your ears felt, all burning in blood, but you cannot remember the feeling behind your heart that day anymore. You speak to it. You're a cat, and I miss you, and you're gone. My heart stands now in the middle of the street. It's starting to rain again. Behind its ears, the morning dew. Sometimes it is so lonely, being with what you thought you'd forgotten. I hear everyone I know hollering in the distance. My heart jumps up and walks away. That was another one where it's like, you know, saying heart in a poem. I wanted to say heart in a poem. Bunch. I like poems. Defensible Space 2. Maybe I will detox in the forest. Maybe I will detox when I'm dead. Even this carcinogen huff, fogging the summer sun, going mean jeans in the farm hands, an offering of ipecac against the tomato harvest. As if that old root solution might wrench the ash cough out of it. The smoke through which the crow flies descended into and all about me. Everywhere, a burning root system. Everywhere, a root fire growing off the splayed tail feathers of the crow. I'll quit there. Thanks.
All right, keep it going for Ian, y'all. This introduction is called Adam Clay's introduction. God made Adam by scooping him out of the earth with a pinky nail, I guess, then breathed life into him, which must have looked like wild. What a moment that must have been. God created this guy in his image, no less. From clay, one would imagine, given its plasticity, which is another word for impressionability. Well, that's the way one story tells it. Same story has God sending mixed signals. He tells Adam a piece of clay to subdue the earth. Things like rocks or oceans, one would imagine, are quite difficult to subdue given their magnitude. How does one allow the earth to have its way with them while simultaneously keeping their own unique shape? Adam Clay, at first glance, the name might seem like a biblical pleonasm. Same difference, right? Adam, clay. But upon further reflection, turns to metaphysical nuance. On the outgoing flight to the pie in the sky, we have Adam, the namer of names, the ingoing, the thinker of thoughts. Now, I'm no creationist, but I can't help but think, what's the big diff? We're here, aren't we? The poet, in his poem, Meditation on the Silence of Morning, considers how, quote, a single moment can make loneliness seem frighteningly new. Adam Clay's poetry leaps off from this point. The razor thinness of new, which is to say, the now. The line, a tightrope, the speaker traipsing above some unfathomable nebulous depth, are waking moments we walk on, utterly thick with it, as Clay describes in his poem, Northern Lights. Quote, in the absolutes of morning, free of comparison, of a drifting scale tipped to an almost perfect balance. None of that language needed now, between meals, between the future departing from disaster. And once the mind slows to the point of regression, then what to make of the first memory arrived upon or within? For you, what would it be? And no, you cannot know what it would be for others. Now, absolutes are often poo-pooed in poetry workshops, charged with lacking both nuance and truth, but the mind in its moment swallows them whole. You always do this. After last night, I'm never drinking again. Or maybe, more depressingly, I'll love you forever. Absolutes are the way in which we lionize ourselves, giants within our small pocket of time and space, against the, for lack of a better word, mundane. I agree with the speaker of the cradle of all there is, italics mine, when they shrug, quote, I'd prefer not to catalog events as normal, mundane, or abnormal, but for the sake of survival, we might as well signal before changing lanes. To turn in either direction of past or future, let alone infinites, sways with the heft of a sea change. The speaker then, like some kind of ancient mechanism, heaves its pendulum side to side. Oh, but exactly 1 second has passed. Such is time in the gauze of a plastic mind, a kind of electric clay. If the lyric is meant to suspend a mote of space-time indefinitely, quote, a microscopic view of a life abridged and abbreviated to a single moment at the kitchen sink, end quote, then at least let it float in terms of hope, like, quote, the wine in this glass straining toward a better time, a better space, from the poem, Start This Record Over. From Robert Haas's poem, Faint Music. I had the idea that the world's so full of pain, it must sometimes make a kind of singing, and that the sequence helps as much as order helps. First an ego, and then pain, and then the singing. And at the opening of Adam Clay's scientific method, the poet commands, music, be still. In the new, in the now, we sense how thin the gauze between us and our end, yeah. But for now, let's taste the wine. Adam Clay, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, Henry. It is bright here, but it's what I wanted. I came to a reading here a couple of months ago and heard the intro, and I was like, I want to read for that series, just so I can be introduced. It's wonderful. Thank you, Henry, Sean, and Rodrigo for having me. Thank you all for being here. Great to be here with friends, new and old. Thank you for the balloons, too. Ian and I demanded balloons, so it's in our writer. Right? So I'm going to read, I think I'm going to read 10 poems, 3 from 3 of my books, and then 1 new poem to close it out. I don't know what I'm going to read yet, but we'll figure out what happens. This first poem is called Self-Portrait with House Slippers and Tap Water, which is a poem kind of riffing off a poem by Jay Hopler, a poet who died recently that I really love his work. His poem was pretty dark. I forget the title of it, but it's sort of a heavy poem, and I just tried to sort of play with that a little bit. It's a poem in 8 parts. Don't worry, they're all really short. I always like to tell people that, because 8 parts is a lot for a poem. So, self-portrait with house slippers and tap water. 1, in bed, a rose thorn in my finger, a celebration of the day was all I turned out to be. 2, maybe disappearing is what I meant. A lover's hair clogging the drain. Maybe disappearing is what I meant. 3, the beginning of a beautiful season. 4, even if what they say, pain exists to magnify love, were true, you wouldn't change your hum to accommodate loneliness. 5, oh dog, can I understand hunger for a moment through your mind? What would heaven be if you couldn't manage abstractions? 6, or if you could. 7, headlights for a reading lamp, the beginning of a beautiful season. 8, I am washing the sand. I am washing each grain of sand. So this is a book I wrote in Michigan. I lived there for about 5 years, which is a place kind of like the South, where when you live there, you write about the weather. The weather kind of finds its way into your work. I thought this poem was sort of appropriate because it's set in the summer, but there was a late frost happening in June when we lived there. The poem also references some Emily Dickinson lines, and today's Emily Dickinson's birthday, if you didn't know that already, so I thought I would read this for her. A poet I love very much. I visited her house a couple of years ago, and you kind of think of her as being this person like in a closet, like writing her poems, but like going to her house, it's like this really well-lit, beautiful house. It's like south-facing, and it gets light all day, so I love thinking about that. So this poem is, you'll hear the lines because they'll be the best lines in the poem. Thought for a stalled world. In early June, a late frost, an airplane coming apart above us and then catching hold in the mind, the dogs down the street lunging at each other, and the grass in your hair from yesterday still there. We have danced over, lived with, barely missed countless splinters, except for the one that went right under my fingernail, straight to the cuticle, a reminder that pain has a beauty all its own. The nail divided down the middle, a line drawn, an elegy hidden in each fingertip, an elegy slipping out in the middle of the night like it owns the place. Because it does. Because it does, we put a price on beauty, on pain, on elegy, and think nothing of it. I do not wish to be didactic. I do not wish to preach to the boy pulling his wagon down the cracked sidewalk, the wagon missing a wheel, for he already knows as well as I do that time is a pitchfork stuck sideways in a barn wall, a note pinned underneath reading, when winds take forest in their paws, the universe is still. And even if it wasn't, we wouldn't even know it. If moving feels this way, think of what being still will do. Imagine thinking of beauty with no momentum behind it. When winds take forest in their paws, the universe is still. I know you heard it, but I'll say it anyway. So I'll read one more poem from this, my second book. This is a poem called Goodbye to All That, the Birds Included. And I wrote a bunch of ekphrastic poems for this collection, poems based on paintings, and they all kind of were bad. I felt like they weren't really working. And I had this sort of breakthrough one day that you could write poems about fake paintings that don't really exist. So one of my friends was like, it's like a fake phrastic poem. So this is a poem kind of based on a painting that I just imagined. So don't go looking for it, I guess. But it's called Goodbye to All That, the Birds Included. I was kind of thinking of Joseph Cornell-Box, which if you know his work is really, really amazing. Goodbye to all that, the birds included. There's some other things in the painting I didn't see the first time around. The hull of a car, the trash scattered in the air. And scholars thought they were birds. I kind of did too. After all this time, goodbye to all that and this and that. I hope the insects become magnetic, to eat plastic hillsides, to pull a drone down even. It might even be a collage now that I'm looking closer. What does any of this even mean? What is there in the world we do not say goodbye to? Goodbye to war? A scholar once said that war makes us rhyme with each other, and music is a fluttering trash in the collage or painting or whatever we want to call it. It's under glass, so I place my face up against the reflection and wait for it to pull me inside. So I'll read now 3 poems from my 3rd book of poems. My newest book came out like in March of 2020, which kind of feels sort of a weird time to have a book come out a little bit. But it's been kind of cool to go back to the old poems and sort of figure how they're talking to the new work. So I'll start with a poem called Nightcap, which is a poem that I wrote after kind of a rough night in Stillwater, Oklahoma. I don't know if you've ever been to Stillwater, Oklahoma, but it's a wild place. So this poem kind of came out of that experience, Nightcap. Some mornings I read poems and my first impulse is to remain silent, as if even the simple act of conversing would further complicate a world continually unfolding before us. Perhaps like an observer on the outside of a field, perhaps like an observer on the outside of a field, the field has somehow clouded the space around me. In moments like last night, one can't help but wonder about the sharp edge of a year and the dullness of them adding up one by one. It's certain I'm not the same person I was back then, and even now I have a temptation to swerve this life off into another one. If life is a flight where I lose everything and everything belongs to oblivion, then I can live with that. After all, what choice do we have? An observer on the outside of a field, I am a different person altogether. I am suddenly standing there with you, your hand touching my arm. Thanks. I'll take that. This next poem is called This Pastoral Way of Living. A lot of my poems come from prompts that I give to my students. I kind of feel like it's like only fair to do what I ask them to do. And this prompt was based on a poem by Rachel Zucker, which was kind of like an anti-pastoral poem. She was kind of like complaining about James Wright in one of her poems. And so then the assignment was to write kind of an anti-poem, like read a poem and then write the response to it. And so I kind of wrote the anti-pastoral poem, sort of responding to Rachel Zucker's poem, which is, I think it's just a pastoral poem, but so anyways. But I lived in Kentucky for about 3 years, so again, if you write about weather when you live in Michigan, like horses are gonna find their way into your poems, usually in Kentucky, so this pastoral way of living. To break a season open with your bare hands would mean disregarding our own perceptions by replacing them with the obsessions of others. In light, the world exists through our knowledge of the sky, tree limbs, and all types of weather, as if anything could fall, as if anything could be categorized as simply weightless or disruptive. I step over raised dirt most days, pretend that its existence can be its own type of belonging. The trees do not move unless the earth thinks to release them. Should we be envious of their immobility? Would it be sensible to pause daily in a sense of knowledge or fear? And what else? I don't entirely believe that one must see something to understand it. In Kentucky, there are horses everywhere, and there are hundreds of roads you can take to see them. I believe in the pastoral because I live in the pastoral. The trees are so bucolic here, they call out at the end of the day, bent under the weight of our unknowing. Some days I take the dogs out to run at land once owned by the Boone family. There I watch the blades of grass stir, and I pause to think about the complications language can bring into the world, a world we can lie down in, a world where often the horses disregard our presence. Like a double fence along the highway, the mind is an expanse, although there's always an end, a border. From one thought to another, I'm calling out to you. I'm calling out to you, as if we're building a nest, one word at a time. I had a student last semester that couldn't snap, so we had to clap at the end of every poem, which was kind of nice. And then we taught her to snap at the very end, so it was good. So I'll read one more poem from Stranger, the first poem, which is called To Take Note of Where We Are, which is a poem that's, I think, speaking to John Ashbery, another poet that I really love. To take note of where we are. Plainly spoken, I am responding to you. Despite our best efforts to will it shut, the proof of the world's existence can best be seen in its insistence, in its opening up. Should we get lost, let us be lost in a familiar space, surrounded by every motion of the unnamed and unseen until the moment they appear. With the sofa in a slightly different place this morning, the room resembles a dream of the room. The details remain present and realistic while everything bends toward one wall in particular. I know what you want, but the wind will not concern itself with us. Thank you. You can heckle too if you want. I've been heckled. I can tell you some stories later. My daughter has heckled me before, actually. Yes, maybe I'll read a poem. A poem about my daughter. So this is one of these poems that was kind of based on an experience that happened to me after Sandy Hook, after the shooting, and trying to kind of figure out how to write about, I don't know, like my daughter was 4 at the time, and trying to think about how to, well, for one, like how to raise a kid in the world that we're living in. But this sort of experience happened where she was sort of the age where, kids, I think, they're kind of like soaking things in before you really realize they're like learning things. Like when she was, I think she was like 1.5 or 2, and she like dropped something, she goes, "God damn it!" It's like she's listening to me. She knows what's happening. And this sort of experience happened to me driving her to school to her daycare one day after Sandy Hook, and just kind of realizing what she was hearing and sort of how to I don't know, to move forward in that world. This poem is a ghazal, which is a form with a lot of repetition. You'll hear it when I read the poem. But it's a kind of poem, this is the sort of poem that like the experience happened to me, but it took me about 5 or 6 years to figure out how to write about it, and I think the form was really a big part of that. So it's called Ghazal for a Farewell Transmission, which also references Jason Molina's songs, which some of you may know, Magnolia Electric Company. So Ghazal for a Farewell Transmission. The line between public and personal, it depends on the world. I know this poem should be no place for the violent acts of the world. Forgive me. After Sandy Hook, I felt fear curl like a fern in each corner's edge, wondered where we ceased to shape our world. Half the mass in our bodies traveled from outside the galaxy, the other half from our own, as if to explain the pull we feel to another world. I think most days of how we will be gone, but not forever, and I write down one memory a day, as if an image can contain a changing world. What did the president say that day, which should have no words? I don't know. I turned the radio off, steered left into a static world. How a tree responds to injury, I learned days before. It creates a barrier zone. It does not heal. It seals itself off from the world. My daughter was in the back seat of the car. I saw her face reflecting each atom within me. Life is a fact aligned with our sense of the world. Thank you. This is where I need a set list, I guess, right? I'll read a couple more poems from this book. This next one's called For Broken Things, and it opens with an Emily Dickinson quote, so she's, again, one of my favorites. The quote is, "Wonder is not precisely knowing, and not precisely knowing not." For Broken Things. No love for the outdoors more than I love this drifting February spring day with a distilling sense of ennui for a different sort of gulf, not this Midwestern prairie or the way a room changes shape because of what it contains. I don't feel tempted to shove the sadness away, but I haven't yet stepped outside of the confines of my lineated mind today. What was a year ago? I ask my phone. And it tells me mistakes are okay, which is what my daughter was thinking 2 years back during a craft talk my friend Natalie was giving to my students about poems, their sense, and their lack of it too. I took notes that day, but that notebook is where? I don't know. My phone also tells me 3 years back I was reminded of Dickinson on Wonder, though I don't know what took me there or where I went from her words, maybe like a dash from her mind into another thought, but more likely toward a cup of coffee I've long since forgotten too. Back in the present, Brian writes to me that aliens would from a distant point see our data centers as the dominant life forms on our warming planet. And they would imagine us to be nothing more than worker bees populating cells while their fans pull sense from every question better left unasked. When I think to elegize the broken or the forgotten, I am mourning the self from a week back, a year, or maybe even a dozen now. It's a miracle to forget, and a shame sometimes we don't. Natalie writes in a poem that whatever she cares for, someone else loves it, deserves it more. And I think about being left alone on an island with a reflection of society, asking what love would even mean without the love of others. There are words this moment. These words this moment are a record of how I'm embracing a single sense of wonder, for the weight sharpens my heart into a perfect fit, into a stumbling mess of stars. Are you keeping track? How many more poems do I have? 2 more? Are you counting? It's good to know. 2 poem warning, that's good. So I'm gonna read a poem called Only Child. There's 3 poems called Only Child in this book, and I think this book is sort of about, just like the shape of the world that we're in, also sort of about a marriage falling apart, but also about just kind of the decision to just have one child and sort of what that means. This poem is sort of a response to Philip Larkin's This Be the Verse, which I'm sure a lot of you know, that opens up with, they fuck you up, your mom and dad, they may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. Just pretty bad, it gets worse from there. So this poem is sort of, I think, a way of trying to think about, I don't know, fatherhood, and I think if you're doing it right as a parent, like your kid should be better than you are somehow. And so this poem, I think, is considering that. So, Only Child. Breakfast rained on again, and I'm lifted up the stairs on the breath of what the dark of the day might promise in its early silence. The light in my daughter's room has been on all night, like every night, but the sun shifting changes the shape of the space from a square into an unfolding universe. I had always imagined a different type of fatherhood before fatherhood found me, but if you ask me to describe it now, I don't think I could find the words. Try to find a way to describe a few different things at once. For a while, I imagined there would be more attempts at trying out what I'm still trying to see in the room that's gone power out. But the weeds in the yard grow too quickly to be left alone for long. I had forgotten the strangeness of a humid February. I had forgotten all that makes up the memories that asked me to exist. It was easier to carve out a place before I had words to describe it. Now, looking back feels like looking forward. It isn't a mistake to see wreckage before it happens. I am drawing a self-portrait and trying to remove the self. Thanks. Thanks again for being here. Ian, I loved hearing your poems. It's really great. I'm going to close with a poem, kind of a new poem. I kind of go through these spurts where I write a poem a day for a month at a time, and the advantage of that is that you can kind of throw a lot of poems away because you have a lot of work. You don't feel precious about them, but this is one of these poems that I've been trying to kind of write for about 7 or 8 months. And it's about a good friend of mine, Matt Hendrickson, who passed away suddenly back in March, and I was in Fayetteville where we lived, and I was at a bar where we used to hang out, and someone said this is the bar where all the moms hang out now. And it used to be a dive bar we used to hang out in, so the title is The Bar in Fayetteville Where All the Moms Now Drink. And I don't know, I think the poem is trying to kind of, I don't know, I think when someone that's your age sort of dies suddenly, it kind of is a wake-up call to you in a lot of ways. You start thinking about your own life and what's happening. So this poem is thinking about that. Thanks again for being here, I really appreciate it. The bar in Fayetteville where all the moms now drink. There was a thread I followed in the quiet of the early aughts, thinking that a proximity to death could illuminate something about art that I couldn't understand otherwise. Perhaps wanting to fix what wasn't broken, or wanting to break what didn't need repair. I didn't know why the cemetery felt so pristine. I didn't know why darkness was the only distance my eyes could adjust to. Now the mothers and fathers in the late afternoon light sit at the same tables where we once sat. Even now, I can see Matt in the back of the room, shooting pool, looking like a muscle of trouble that could never unspool or unravel, no matter how hard one might pull on it. Thanks so much, y'all.
For both Ian Lockaby and Adam Flagg. If you're in the city, you're on the grid. If you're on the grid, you're a point on a map. The point on the map must have a pragmatic purpose. If you have a purpose, you are the sign. You are here. And so I'd like you to give yourselves a round of applause for being here. You've been here for the first season of Splice, and we couldn't do it without you. And so I know that it's sort of like, give it up for Ian. And people are like, yeah. Give it up for Adam. Yeah. And then I'm like, give it up for yourselves. And like, that should be the one who's like, yeah! And that's really how I feel about y'all, which was kind of overkill here, I realize, especially with the reaction. But that's how I feel in my heart, okay? In my heart. In my heart. And so, on behalf of Sean, Rodrigo, and myself, and Splice Poetry Series, seriously thank you for, this would not happen without you, and so keep it coming. Season 2 starts next month. We have the clown, experimental, wild, theatrical clown poet, Alex Jatarski. She's coming in from New York. And then a famous film critic or something called her, quote, a finely tuned absurdist. So naturally, we paired her together with our not so finely tuned absurdist, Sean Monroe of Splice. So it will certainly be one of the wildest shows we've had yet, if not ever. So please do make sure you clear your calendar for that date. Thank you again, and we'll see you on the other side.